I knew the HOA hated me the minute I moved in. Not because I was loud. Not because I didn't keep my lawn trimmed. No, it was because I didn't bow to their fake authority. And the queen of the madness? Agnes Zimmerman. Middle-aged, tightly wound, with a voice that could peel paint and a permanent scowl like she just sucked on a lemon. She chaired the HOA like it was a military unit and everyone else was a private who'd forgotten to salute. I'm Vincent Walker. I'm a contractor, been working with my hands since I was 16, and I know how to fix just about anything. Bought this house in a quiet cul-de-sac in a supposedly exclusive community because I liked the layout. Had a big yard for my dog, solid foundation, and a finished basement where I could set up my workshop. First week there, Agnes showed up unannounced, clipboard in hand, tapping her pen on the door like she was doing me a favor just by being there. "You'll need to repaint your mailbox," she said without even introducing herself. HOA guidelines require a flat black finish. No gloss. The mailbox was black, maybe a little shinier than hers, but still black. "I'm not repainting it," I told her. "It's fine." Her eyes widened like I'd slapped her. "Excuse me. You heard me. It's a mailbox, not a chandelier." From that day on, it was war. Petty fines for overgrown lawn when my grass was 2 inches. Complaints about my truck being parked in my own driveway. At one point, she even tried to tell me my dog couldn't be outside past 8 p.m. Each time, I'd appeal. Each time, they'd deny it. But I kept everything: photos, letters, timestamps. I wasn't just letting it slide. I was building a file. Then came the real sabotage. Started with a weird smell in my basement. Faint, but definitely sewage. I went down, flipped on the lights, and nearly gagged. Raw sewage. Inches of it. Bubbling up from the floor drain like some kind of sick geyser. I waded back upstairs, furious, and called the utility company. They came out, scoped the line, and told me something that made my blood boil. "Looks like someone manually shut a valve on the HOA-maintained line. Backed everything up into your property. You saying this was intentional?" The guy gave me a look. "Let's just say it doesn't happen by accident." I didn't even need to guess who was behind it. Agnes. I went to the HOA office the next morning, stormed in mid-meeting. There she was, sitting at the head of the table like she was judging a beauty pageant for dandelions. "You flooded my basement," I said. She blinked slowly, lips twitching. "Excuse me." "Sewage. Backed up from the HOA line." Utility guy confirmed it. "Someone shut off a valve that had no business being touched." She folded her arms. "Well, if your plumbing was up to code." I cut her off. "Don't you dare. You think I don't know how my own plumbing works?" The other board members fidgeted, but none of them spoke. "Cowards." Agnes leaned back, smug. "If there's an issue with the common line, it's your responsibility to report it. We can't be held liable for your negligence." "Negligence?" I barked out a laugh. "I have video from my security camera. The one by the maintenance box." That got her attention. Her jaw twitched. "Oh yeah," I said, pulling out my phone. "Want to see the footage of your groundskeeper opening the HOA valve at 2 in the morning and then walking off like nothing happened?" Her face drained of color. She opened her mouth, then closed it. I didn't wait for her to recover. "You think you can mess with me? You have no idea who you're dealing with." Because here's the thing: my brother, Dorian, owns the whole block of rental homes the board members live in. Every single one of them. They never knew. The properties are under his LLC and he keeps a low profile. But when I told him what happened, he was livid. "You want me to evict them?" he asked, calm as ever. "Every last one," I said. He nodded. "Give me a day." The next morning, notices went out. 30-day terminations of month-to-month leases. Legal. Binding. Brutal. They'd all signed agreements that allowed for no-cause termination. And Dorian doesn't bluff. By noon, the HOA office was in chaos. Agnes was already outside my house, banging on the door like a lunatic. "You can't do this," she screeched when I opened it. "Actually, we can," I said. "You remember Dorian, right?" "Wait, no, you never met him. But he knows all of you. And now he's done renting to snakes." Her face went purple. "You'll regret this. We'll sue." "For what?" I said. "Enforcing the lease terms? Or maybe for retaliating against me with a sewage attack? Because I've already filed a police report." She froze. "Oh, and I forwarded the footage to the city inspector. They're looking into misuse of municipal lines. That's a felony, by the way." She stumbled back like I'd slapped her. I stepped out onto the porch. "You came after the wrong guy, Agnes." I don't play games. I end them. She stormed off, but her confidence was gone. And as I watched her march back to that little office, I knew this was far from over. She'd started a war. But I had the high ground. I didn't hear a peep from Agnes for 3 days. That silence was louder than her usual complaints. And that told me one thing: she was regrouping. I spent those days gutting the basement. The smell hadn't left. Even after hauling out the soaked drywall, tossing the carpet into a dumpster, and running industrial fans day and night, there was a lingering stench that clung to the concrete like mildew's angry cousin. I'd done sewage remediation jobs for clients before, but doing it in my own home? That hit different. Every time I found another ruined tool or soaked blueprint, it fueled the low boil of fury that hadn't left me since the night I caught their groundskeeper on camera. I wasn't sitting idle, though. I'd already filed an incident report with the city's public works department. A buddy of mine, Marcus, worked there. He was a quiet guy, but sharp. He called me 2 days after the report. "Vincent," he said, "you're not going to believe what I found." "Try me," I said, while scraping tile adhesive off the floor. "You were right. That valve on the HOA maintained lateral line? It had a tamper lock. Should have never been touched without prior notice to the city." "Let me guess," I said, already knowing. "There's no record of scheduled maintenance. No emergency call-outs. But get this, someone used a bypass key. Not city issue. Looked like a third-party knockoff. Illegal to even own." He paused. "I'm writing it up. I've got to pass this to code enforcement and utilities fraud. You're going to be hearing from a few departments." Good. That afternoon, I was outside hauling debris from the basement when a black Escalade rolled up to the front of my house. Out stepped a man in a tailored gray suit, sunglasses, and polished shoes that didn't belong anywhere near my gravel driveway. He didn't introduce himself, just held out a leather folder and said, "You've been served." I flipped it open. Lawsuit, filed by the HOA. They were accusing me of defamation, harassment, and damaging the reputation of the community through false allegations. The gall. They really thought they could bluff their way out of this. I tossed the folder onto the porch without a word and went back to work. That evening, I called my friend Nadine. She was a civil litigator who'd built her career defending small business owners from corporate overreach. The moment I mentioned the HOA's name, she asked if it was the same one that had been flagged by a local watchdog group for questionable financial practices. "Wait," I said, setting down my coffee mug. "What kind of practices?" "Misallocating reserve funds. Failing to disclose special assessments." A few residents tried to get answers last year, and the board shut them down. One guy got threatened with foreclosure over a made-up landscaping violation. Why haven't they been nailed yet? Lack of hard evidence. Until now. I emailed her everything. The footage of the valve tampering. Copies of all the phony fines. The city report Marcus had just sent me. It was enough to give her a week's worth of work, but she didn't hesitate. "This lawsuit is garbage," she said. "We'll countersue. And I mean full nuclear." The next morning, I noticed something odd. 2 of the board members had moving trucks in their driveways. Big ones. Not the "we're just replacing furniture" kind, but full-on relocation rigs. I didn't say anything. Just watched from my porch as cardboard boxes got packed into cargo bays, and the men who'd once voted to fine me for unauthorized exterior lighting now struggled to get their sectional couch through the front door. Dorian had wasted no time. He wasn't one for warnings or grace periods. He told me he'd handle it, and clearly he had. By noon, one of the trucks was gone. The other sat half-loaded, with the driver sitting in the cab thumbing through a crossword. A woman I recognized as board secretary Marlene came stomping out of the house, waving her phone like it was a sword. "You can't just kick us out," she shouted to no one in particular. The driver didn't even look at her. "You know what this is?" she barked. "This is retaliatory eviction." She turned and saw me standing on my lawn. "This is because of you." I didn't flinch. "No. This is because you backed a corrupt board and thought there wouldn't be consequences." She stalked back inside. Later that day, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I let it ring out. They left a voicemail. It was from a guy named Todd Langley. Used to be on the board before Agnes took over. He left a message asking to meet. Said he had information. I met him at a diner on the edge of town. He looked tired, like someone who hadn't slept through the night in months. As soon as we sat down, he slid a folder across the table. "Bank statements," he said. "Minutes from meetings that were never recorded officially. Agnes never let them go public. I opened the folder. There were pages of transactions payments to consultants with no names, checks written to cash, and one that really caught my eye. A $5,000 withdrawal labeled Emergency Maintenance Lot 22. That's my house, I said. He nodded. She claimed it was for a contractor to fix a drainage issue. That was before your basement flooded. But I asked around. No one ever saw a contractor on your street. No permit applications either. I leaned back. So she used HOA funds to pay someone to sabotage my property. Todd hesitated. I can't prove that's what it was for. But the timing lines up. I looked at him. Why come forward now? He rubbed his face. Because I wanted to stand up months ago, but I didn't have the guts. I didn't know she'd go this far. And now my wife's saying we should move because people are afraid to speak against her. You're not the only one, I said. She's about to find out what it feels like to have the light turned on. The next day, Nadine filed a countersuit. It named the HOA as a whole and specifically Agnes, Marlene, and the remaining board member who hadn't yet packed up and left. The claim? Property damage, civil harassment, and misuse of public utilities. And the cherry on top? An injunction to freeze the HOA's operating accounts until a full audit could be conducted. Every dollar they'd skimmed, hidden, or misused was now under a microscope. The very next night, someone tried to break into my garage. They didn't get far. The motion-activated floodlights snapped on, and I watched from the upstairs window as a figure in a black hoodie bolted down the driveway and into the trees behind my lot. I didn't chase him. I didn't need to. The next morning, I installed a second set of cameras. High-res, night vision, audio pickup, and I dropped a copy of the footage off at the sheriff's department. By the end of the week, Agnes made her move. She called an emergency HOA meeting. Flyers were taped to mailboxes. Emails went out. She was trying to rally support, probably hoping some of the residents didn't know what was already unraveling. I showed up early. The meeting was held in the community center's main hall. About 30 people trickled in. Some sat in folding chairs. Others stood in the back, arms crossed. Agnes took the podium like she was addressing a courtroom. There have been rumors going around, she began. False accusations. Attacks on our community's integrity. I raised my hand. She ignored me. I want to remind everyone that we, your board, have worked tirelessly to maintain standards, to protect property values, to ensure this remains a safe, beautiful place to live. A man in the back coughed loudly. Someone else muttered, "Yeah, right?" I stepped forward. This board, I said, used HOA funds to commit an illegal act against a homeowner. They orchestrated property damage, tampered with municipal utilities, and then tried to silence me with a lawsuit. Gasps rippled through the room. Agnes slammed her hand on the podium. "You are not recognized to speak." I ignored her. City investigators have already opened a file. Evidence has been submitted. And anyone who continues to support this leadership is complicit in the cover-up. People began whispering. 2 residents stood up and walked out. A third called out, "Is it true about the audit?" "Yes," I said. "And if you want to know where your dues have been going? You'll find out soon enough." Agnes tried to shout over me, but her voice cracked. "The board hereby moves to expel Vincent Walker from the association for conduct unbecoming." "You don't have the authority to expel me," I said calmly. "I own my property. You can't strip me of that. And once the audit's complete, you won't even have your positions." That was when the real shift happened. People who'd been silent started asking questions, demanding to see financials, requesting a special election. Agnes tried to shut it all down, but the tide had turned. She no longer held the room. She'd ruled with fear and manipulation. But now the neighborhood smelled blood. And it wasn't mine. 2 days after the HOA meeting imploded, a notice quietly went up on the community bulletin board outside the rec center. It wasn't flashy, just a printed sheet inside a weatherproof sleeve, but the message was impossible to ignore. Special election, interim board vote scheduled. The names listed beneath were entirely unfamiliar. Not a single current board member was up for re-election. That alone told the story. Agnes and her cronies weren't stepping down, they were being replaced. I didn't attend that vote. I didn't need to. The outcome was already sealed. The residents had seen enough. They didn't need more speeches or promises. They needed change, and they were finally willing to take it. The morning after, I was on my porch replacing a damaged banister rail, when a man I'd never seen before walked up the path. Mid-40s, plaid shirt, sunburned neck. He looked like he worked with his hands. "You Vincent." "That's me." He held out a folded envelope. "I live on Maple Court. My name's Ray. I own lot 16. I found this in my mailbox last week. Thought you should see it." I opened it. Inside was a copy of an invoice for tree removal consultation services dated 3 months prior. The vendor name was generic Green Solutions, but the address matched a P.O. box across town. The total? Just under $5,000. "Problem is," Ray said, "there ain't no trees on my lot. Never have been. I called the number listed and it's disconnected. Figured you might know what to do with it." I added it to the folder. By now, the pile of evidence was thicker than a dictionary. Nadine had already submitted the first wave to the County Oversight Board. Now that we had documentation showing not only misuse of funds but fabricated expenses, we weren't just looking at civil penalties. We were stepping into criminal territory. Around noon, I got a call from Marcus again. This time, his tone was different. "You're not gonna believe who showed up at the city utilities office this morning," he said. "Try me. Agnes Zimmerman. Tried to file a retroactive maintenance report. Claimed the valve issue was an emergency service oversight. She even brought a fake work order. She really walked in with a forged document, handed it straight to my supervisor. But she spelled the contractor's name wrong. Claimed it was City Sewer Response Incorporated. There's no such company. We checked. Did they report it? Already in motion. Supervisors calling in the municipal fraud team. I hung up and leaned against the porch column, watching a squirrel dart across the yard. Agnes wasn't just desperate, she was reckless. And that meant she was close to collapse. Later that afternoon, Dorian swung by. He rarely visited in person unless it was serious. He parked his truck behind mine, climbed out slowly, and tossed a manila folder onto the tailgate. "Final notices went out," he said. "Marlene's already vacated. The other 2 are trying to lawyer up. They don't have a case. They don't have a lease anymore either. I've got property managers inspecting the units next week. If they left damage, we'll pursue it." I flipped open the folder. Inside were photos of each property: open cabinets, stained carpets, holes in drywall. One of them had ripped a thermostat off the wall like it owed the money. They didn't leave quietly. "No," Dorian said. "But they left. That's what matters." I closed the folder. They thought they had power. Turns out they were just renters. "Which is why I never bought anything in an HOA," he said. As he drove off, I noticed a car idling down the street. Not familiar. Gray sedan, tinted windows. It didn't move when Dorian passed it. Didn't move when I walked down the driveway to get the mail. Just sat there. I took a picture of the plate. That night, I reviewed the footage from the garage break-in attempt. The figure in the hoodie had slipped out of frame too fast to get a face, but I caught something else: the stitching on the sleeve. A patch. HOA grounds team. I zoomed in. The outline matched the uniform their former maintenance guy had worn. The same one who tampered with the valve in the first place. I sent the stills to Nadine. The next morning, she called me before I'd finished my coffee. "He's the missing link," she said. "I need his name. Can't find it." They never listed staff on the HOA site. Then we dig. She subpoenaed employment records from the HOA's vendor contracts. Within 24 hours, we had a name: Calvin Rowe. Former grounds contractor. No business license. Paid under the table through general maintenance funds. I looked him up. No website, no business cards. But I did find a social media page with a blurry photo of him at a backyard barbecue. The background showed a cooler full of beer and, more importantly, a distinctive tattoo on his neck: a coiled snake with red eyes. I forwarded the image to Marcus. An hour later, he replied. The city had surveillance footage from a public works building the night before the sabotage. It showed Calvin standing next to the valve box with a flashlight in one hand and bolt cutters in the other. The timestamp matched the backflow. Nadine filed a supplemental report with the county. Now we weren't just talking about civil fraud. We had enough for criminal mischief, utility tampering, and conspiracy to defraud. That afternoon, I got a knock at the door. This time it wasn't a process server or an angry board member. It was a reporter. She introduced herself as Erin Hall from the local paper. Said she'd been tipped off by a resident about ongoing litigation involving HOA corruption. "Off the record," she said. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest. I've got people calling in with stories about Agnes from as far back as 5 years ago. One woman claims she was fined for having wind chimes. Wind chimes. They said it was a noise disturbance. I let her in. We spoke for nearly an hour. I walked her through the timeline, showed her the city reports, the video evidence, the forged invoice from Ray, and the housing documents Dorian had provided. I don't want to be the center of this, I told her. But people need to know how deep this went. She took notes fast. Barely glanced up. By the time she left, her notepad was full. 3 days later, the article went live: Power, Lies, and Raw Sewage, how one HOA tried to bury a homeowner and got flushed instead. It exploded. Residents from other neighborhoods started reaching out. Some wanted to compare notes. Others were furious about their own boards and wanted legal advice. I forwarded them to Nadine. She was already fielding calls from a class action firm that had caught wind of the mess. The fallout hit fast. The HOA's insurance carrier suspended coverage pending investigation. Without it, the association couldn't operate legally. They canceled all upcoming meetings. The bank froze their reserve account. Agnes vanished. Her house sat dark for days. Then, early one morning, a tow truck pulled into her driveway and hauled away her car. Later that same day, movers arrived. No one came out to direct them. They walked in, packed up the house, and left before sunset. She was gone. Just like that. The new board, composed of actual residents this time, held their first meeting in the rec center. This time it was open to all. No closed-door votes. No secret budgets. They invited me to speak. I kept it short. I didn't ask for this fight, I said. But I wasn't going to let them destroy my home. None of us should have to live under threats or lies. From now on, we hold people accountable. Applause broke out. Not the polite kind. The kind that comes from people who remember what it felt like to be ignored. As I stepped down, Ray clapped me on the shoulder. You turned the tide, he said. No, I replied. They turned it. I just gave them a push. That night, I finally cleaned the last of the sewage stains from the basement floor. The smell was gone. The air was dry. And for the first time since I moved in, the house felt like mine again. No board, no threats, just brick, wood, and silence. And that was all I ever wanted. The new board wasted no time cleaning house figuratively and literally. Within days of Agnes's departure, they brought in an independent audit firm that specialized in HOA financial reviews. Not a single member of the previous board was allowed back into the office. The locks were changed, the files boxed up, and a city enforcement officer stood by for the entire process. I wasn't involved in the internal cleanup. I had other things to focus on, like finishing the basement, replacing the drywall, sealing the subfloor, and installing a proper drainage backflow preventer. Not because I expected someone else to sabotage the line again, but because I'd learned exactly how far people could go when they thought no one was watching. One afternoon, while hanging new shelves in the workshop, I got a knock at the side door. I wiped my hands on my jeans and opened it to find a young guy holding a clipboard and a tool belt slung over one shoulder. Name's Kyle, he said. I'm with the audit team. They asked me to take a look at the utility access points on each property. Verify nothing was tampered with beyond what we already have on record. You mind if I check your outdoor valve box? I led him around back. He crouched by the concrete access lid and gently pried it open with a flat tool. After a moment, he clicked on a flashlight and peered down. No seal, he said. Should have had a tamper cap. Guess it wasn't just yours they messed with. He pulled out his phone and took a photo. Find anything else like that? I asked. He stood, brushing his hands off. Yeah, for properties so far. All with the same pattern, valves opened or capped incorrectly, and all tied to complaints that went nowhere. Looks like they were using the utility system to bully people. I nodded. That tracks. He hesitated. You're Walker, right? Guy who brought it all down. I tilted my head slightly. I didn't bring anything down. They collapsed under their own weight. I just refused to be quiet about it. He smiled faintly. Well, thanks. My aunt lives down the street. Agnes fined her for stepping stones in her garden. Said they disrupted the visual flow or some nonsense. People like that only stay in charge because no one pushes back. When Kyle left, I closed the access lid carefully, making a mental note to order a custom locking cap. I wasn't going to let anyone near the valve again, not without a damn key. A few evenings later, the new board invited residents to a community gathering. No speeches, No voting. Just a barbecue in the park at the center of the neighborhood. I almost didn't go. I wasn't a fan of crowds and I didn't want to become some kind of mascot for the HOA resistance. But around 6, I grabbed a folding chair and headed down the street. When I got there, a dozen grills were already smoking, kids were chasing each other between picnic tables, and someone had rigged up a pair of speakers playing bluesy guitar riffs. The smell of charcoal and grilled onions hung heavy in the warm air. I nodded to a few people as I passed. Some nodded back. One woman gave me a shy thumbs up. Another handed me a cold soda without saying a word. Near the center of the lawn, I spotted Ray with a paper plate piled high with ribs. He waved me over and nudged a chair toward me with his foot. "You see the new newsletter?" he asked, mouth half full. "I don't get paper mail. What's in it?" Full breakdown of every dollar the old board spent in the last 18 months. Turns out they were billing the HOA for private lawn care. Agnes had a gardener on retainer 2 visits a week. I raised an eyebrow. "Must be nice." "Not anymore," he said. I leaned back and looked around. The vibe was different now. People weren't looking over their shoulders. They weren't whispering in small groups or avoiding eye contact. They were laughing, talking, acting like neighbors. I spotted Erin, the reporter, near the snack table. She caught my eye and walked over, holding a notebook under one arm. "You've got fans," she said. 3 families told me they canceled plans to sell their homes after all this came out. Said they feel like they can breathe again. I didn't do it for that. I know. But it doesn't change what it did for them. She flipped her notebook open and glanced down. "I'm doing a follow-up. Not just about the HOA, but about how communities fix themselves after something like this. You mind if I ask what kept you from backing down?" I thought about that. About the night the sewage first bubbled up through my floor. About the way Agnes had looked at me like I was beneath her. About the silence of the board members who let her run wild. "I wasn't raised to let bullies win," I said finally. "And I don't like the idea of someone thinking a title gives them the right to stomp on people." She scribbled something, then paused. "You think they'll face criminal charges?" I looked out across the lawn. At the people who'd been fined for garden gnomes and porch lights. At the kids who could now ride their bikes without Agnes's clipboard looming in the background. "If there's any justice," I said, "they'll answer for every lie they told." That evening, after the sun dipped below the rooftops and the last of the charcoal burned out, I walked home under a sky streaked with orange. The porch light clicked on as I stepped up the front steps. Quiet. Solid. Mine. Inside, I sat at the kitchen table and opened the folder that had grown fat over the past few weeks. Evidence, notes, reports, everything that had come to light. I pulled out the city summons. Calvin Rose hearing was scheduled for the following month. Then the letter from the county attorney's office, confirming that an investigation into misuse of funds had formally begun. And finally, a handwritten note from the new board president. It was short, just a thank you and a line that stuck with me. Sometimes, it only takes one person to remind the rest of us that we still have a voice. I folded the note and set it on the shelf above the fireplace. Then I opened the basement door and flipped on the light. The space was clean now, dry. Shelves stocked, tools hung in neat rows, the faint scent of cedar from the new paneling still lingering in the air. I walked down the steps not because I needed anything, but because I could. Because the place that had once been a symbol of what they tried to do to me was now just a room again. A room I'd reclaimed. The war was over, and I'd won it on my terms.